We are taking a look at the GPD WIN MAX 2 Intel 1260p model in our review today. We will be doing all the usual unboxing and overview of the handheld, then performing some system and games benchmarks, followed by games and emulator testing. Lifting the box lid reveals the GPD WIN MAX 2. We will show this in more detail shortly. Underneath is a user manual which is in Chinese and English. It contains everything you need to use the WIN MAX 2. There's a bag containing a small screw for securing a M.2 SSD inside. There is a USB Type-C cable for charging the WIN MAX 2. And last but not least is a charger. We will include the correct adapter for your country. When closed, the WIN MAX 2 measures 8.9 by 6.2 by 0.9 inches and weighs 1005 grams. The display is a 10.1 inch touchscreen with a native resolution of 1920 by 1200, but it supports up to 2560 by 1600. Below the display is a 2 megapixel high refresh rate camera, which is great for video calls. There is a clickable touchpad for mouse style navigation. But where's the gaming controls? There are two covers which hide them if you want to use your WIN MAX 2 at work, for example. You have the usual gaming controls, dual clickable analog Hall sensor sticks, D-pad and gaming buttons. On the front is a power button which has a built-in fingerprint sensor for fast logging into Windows. On the left side are micro and full-sized SD card slots. On the right side are two USB 3.2 Gen 2 ports. On the back are left and right shoulder and trigger buttons. There's a 3.5mm headphone jack and a USB 3.2 port. Next is a HDMI port for connecting to a TV or monitor. There are two USB Type-C ports. One is Thunderbolt 4 for connecting to an eGPU, for example. And above the two slots are where the controller covers are stored. The GPD WIN MAX 2 features the Intel Core i7 1260p processor, running up to 4.7 GHz with a default 20 to 28 watts TDP. It has the Intel Iris Xe graphics with a max frequency of 1.4 GHz. There's 16 gigs of fast LPDDR5 RAM and a 1TB M.2 SSD. The storage can be expanded with the additional M.2 SSD slot. For communication, there is an optional SIM card module that supports up to 4G. There is Wi-Fi 6 and Bluetooth 5.2 support. The WIN MAX 2 is powered by a 67 watt-hour battery. In our tests at 20 watts TDP, we got around 8 hours on idle and 3 hours 30 minutes under full load running Cinebench. PassMark pushes the CPU, GPU, RAM and storage to their maximum in a series of tests. The GPD WIN MAX 2 scores 4,233. We will be comparing the results with other handhelds shortly. 3DMark tests the CPU and GPU together to see how they work in video processing tasks. The WIN MAX 2 scores 1,682 at 20 watts TDP. Comparing it to other models at different TDPs, we can see that the WIN MAX 2 overall runs slower than the 1X Player Gundam, which has the same 1260p processor. But it does run faster than the best available AMD model and faster than the Max 2021. Cinebench tests the CPU to see its performance with either single or multi-core tests. We are testing on multi-core and get a score of 6,491, which is pretty good. CrystalDiskMark runs a series of tests on the storage to see its performance across different reading and writing patterns. We get a maximum read speed of 2090 megs and write speed of 1957 megs. It's not the fastest we have seen, but far away from being the slowest. We will be running game benchmarks at 11, 20 and 35 watts TDP to see the difference between them and how well TDP scales up in performance. We start the game in benchmarks with Forza Horizon 5 running at 1280 by 800 on the lowest graphic settings. At the end of the benchmark, we get an average frames per second of 26, 54 and 59 at their respective TDPs. Surprisingly, the FPS is overall lower than the other three models. This might be down to different game versions, but we should not see a difference that large. Up next we have Street Fighter 5 and we are running at 1280 by 800 on the maximum graphic settings. At the end of the first match we get an average of 32.64 frames per second at 11 watts and reaching the maximum 60 at 20 watts and above. We can see at 11 watts that the Max 2 falls behind other models in performance, but at 20 watts it gets at 60 frames per second, beating the AMD and previous Max model. On the Final Fantasy XIV benchmark, we are running at 1280 by 800 on the maximum graphic setting. We got final scores of 2868, 6347 and 7038. Again, it is noticeably different to the One X player and very surprisingly the Max 2021. Our final games benchmark is Shadow of the Tomb Raider running at 1280 by 800 on the lowest graphic settings. At the end of the benchmark we get an average frames per second of 21, 43 and 50. Again we see the Max 2 behind the other models in performance across all of the TDPs. We double checked the benchmark results and did get similar scores. The benchmark results are quite mixed for the GPD WIN MAX 2. In system and gaming tests we see it fall behind, often with a large gap compared to the One X player Gundam which has the same processor. We were expecting a close gap, but there is a noticeable performance difference. Compared to the Aya Neo Next Pro, there are performance increases over its AMD rival in the benchmarks, which Intel is usually higher scoring than the AMD. However, when the tables are turned, such as Forza Horizon 5, we can still see a 10 frames per second gap. Compared to the WIN MAX 2021, there were some surprising results. In 2 of the 5 comparable benchmarks, the Max 2021 beat the Max 2 at 35 watts, as well as on other TDPs. This could be for a number of reasons, such as drivers or optimization, as the 1260p is a fairly new processor. We will now try a few games, followed by some emulator tests at playable settings. We start off with the recently released Neon Abyss. We are running at 1920 by 1080 on the default graphic settings at 20 watts TDP. We are getting a solid 60 frames per second throughout the game. It looks and plays great on the Max 2. Also recently released is Turtle Shredder's Revenge. We are playing this great game at 20 watts TDP at 2400 by 1350 resolution and at the game's default graphic settings. We are getting a solid 60 frames per second, although it is a fairly basic game to be fair. You can lower the TDP and still get 60 FPS. And something a little older but more demanding is Doom Eternal. We are running at 1280 by 800 on the default low graphic settings. We are getting above 60 frames per second for the majority of the game and some minor dips below now and again. The game is better optimised for AMD, but it still runs fairly well on Intel. The GPD WIN MAX 2 is more than powerful enough to run all up to Dreamcast and PlayStation 2 era. So we will skip those and check out some of the more recent or demanding systems. We start with PlayStation 3. This is still a work in progress emulator, so not all games will run well. We tried a few different games and got mixed results as expected. Tekken 6 works perfectly as an example of a game running great. With other games that do not run full speed, you can limit the frame rate to 30 and usually get great results. Next up, we have the 3D dual screen emulator Citra. Again, this is a mixed bag of what works and doesn't, as the emulator is still in active development. We tried a few games, and Sonic Generations is an example of a playable game once you have generated the shader caches. Other games also work just fine, but some are slow due to incompatibility or generating too many shader caches at once. We are trying the PlayStation Portable Emulator PPSSPP with God of War, and are pretty much getting a solid 60 frames per second. You can increase the graphics resolution as well as some other tweaks for the majority of games and get great looking graphics at full speed. Up next, we are checking out the Dolphin emulator. Burnout 2 works perfectly at 60 frames per second. Ultimate Spider-Man, which is a game known for being highly demanding, runs at a solid 25 frames per second, which looks like it's the limit for this unoptimised game without using a hack. On the other system Dolphin emulates, we are again seeing some great results. The last story is blazing along at high frame rates and is very playable, as are other first and third party games. The OG Xbox emulator runs a fair number of titles very well. Mashed and Soul Calibur 2 are running at playable frame rates. Not every game will work as well though. Keep in mind this emulator is still in development, but a good number of games are playable. And we finish off with something a bit more recent. Yuzu and DROIX emulators are both in development, so performance and compatibility can vary between releases. We tried a number of games, both first and third party titles, and got some great results, with many running at full or near full speed. Overall, the GPD WIN MAX 2 is a good alternative to the AMD offerings that are currently available. It is a shame that the performance does not quite meet the 1X Player Gundam edition, which unfortunately is not available to buy outside China. If you have one of the other current generation handhelds, then it might be worth holding out a bit longer to upgrade, as there's not a massive difference in performance. If it is your first Windows handheld experience, then the Max 2 Intel is a good option, but do consider waiting for the AMD model, as this will have far higher performance. And also do take into account that it's not just a gaming handheld. It has a great keyboard that I use to type out the notes for this review. It can very easily replace your laptop, and after a hard day's work, simply transform into a gaming handheld. You can learn more about the GPD WIN MAX 2 and order yours today on our stores at DROIX.co.uk and DROIX.net, or you can browse our wide range of Windows handhelds. That wraps up this GPD WIN MAX 2 review. We hope you have enjoyed it. If you would like to see another video with more games or emulators, let us know in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe if you have not already, and we hope to see you back in the next video.